When you think about the mighty battleships of the Second World War, you probably think of such ships as the Royal Navy's Warspite, the Kriegsmarine's Bismarck, the United States Navy's Iowa class, or the Imperial Japanese Navy's Yamato. However, little attention is given to the battleships of a major player in the Second World War, the Soviet Union. During the Second World War, they had 4 total battleships, 3 of which were in fighting condition, minus the Foons. The active battleships were the October Revolution, the Jean Palmer, both in the Baltic, while the Paris Commune was in the Black Sea. These battleships were all first-generation dreadnoughts that had been modernized during the interwar period. These battleships saw active combat through a lot of the Second World War, but not on the high seas, mostly bombarding German positions near places like Leningrad or Sevastopol. All 3 battleships sustained damage, most notably the Jean-Paul Marat being essentially blown in 2. In today's video, we'll cover the limited activities of Soviet battleships during the Second World War. I know what some of you are thinking. You're probably thinking about the Soviet Soyo class or the Kronstadt-class battlecruisers, but we're not going to get into those today, just simply for the fact that they were never completed and didn't really participate in any of the battles. Well, the battleships of the Ganget class, as I mentioned in the introduction, were first-generation dreadnoughts built for the Imperial Russian Navy during the late 1900s and early 1910s, and were an interesting design with all 12 of their 305mm or 12-in guns along the center line of the ship in triple turrets. With these particulars as found in Russian and Soviet battleships by Stephen McLaughlin, they were certainly a little out of date by the 1920s and 1930s, as we've talked about in my videos about Mara and her modernization and the subsequent problems faced by the Soviets, from these modernizations to the October Revolution, Jean Pomera in the Paris Commune. Their modernizations are a bit outside the scope of this video. Just know the battleships on the eve of war were in good enough condition to fire their guns in steam. Of course, minus the FRS, as she had suffered a catastrophic fire in 1919 and was mostly forgotten, besides using her for cannibalization for the other battleships and possible refits to her, although we should cover her in a future video. These were the most modern battleships of the Soviet fleet on the eve of the Second World War. Most modern in terms of actually being constructed and in service with capital ships on the slipways, such as the Kronstadt class or Svetsky Soyuz. The Gangets were certainly not a match for the other battleships of this period, even the older ones. Still, the Soviet battleships were stationed in important parts of the nation and were going to assist in war efforts in important ways, and starting in the Baltic, where, to take from Stephen McLaughlin when discussing the Soviet naval policy and German-Soviet non-aggression pact, Stalin wasted no time in taking advantage of this to bolster the Soviet Union's defensive position, especially its maritime defenses. Stalin's goals were shaped by naval strategy as he understood it, and, ironically, the strategy he sought to carry out was in an almost exact repeat of the mine artillery position advocated by the very same Tsarist-trained Spetsy that the dictator had destroyed in the early 1930s. As Admiral Kuznetsov wrote in his memoirs, our defense in the Gulf of Finland were based on the system for the defense of Petrograd in the First World War. Modernized, of course. The main mine position was located on the meridian of Tallinn. Here, ships and coastal batteries should have given battle to the enemy if he were to attempt to force his way into the Gulf of Finland. So with that, Soviet plans in the event of war, especially with the acquisition of Estonia and the important base at Tallinn, was to place mine barriers and install gun batteries on the coast, and to patrol the waters in the mouth of the Gulf of Finland. Of course, the Finns might have problems with their incorporation to the Soviet Union and the acquisition of their coastal defense guns, but that, of course, was going to take time for the Soviets in the Winter War. Still, in the Winter War, a goal for the Soviet Union was the Hango Peninsula, a critical point for the mine artillery barrier, which the Soviets gained during the war, completing the northern end of the mine barrier in early 1940. But with the acquisition of Tallinn and Hango, the ships of the Soviet fleet, including the two battleships of the Baltic fleet, were stationed in Tallinn rather than in Kronstadt at the outset of the war. We'll get into the Paris Commune in the black. See in a bit. So when it came to the actual combat, the Soviet battleships in the Baltic fleet based in the Second World War, including the Winter War, as it's easier to include it here. The Marat and the October Revolution both participated briefly in the Winter War against Finland. On December 18, 1939, the October Revolution shelled a Finnish coastal battery of 10-inch guns at Sodanpää on the island of Quisto in the eastern approaches to Viborg. The Finnish guns were having mechanical problems at the time, and after 10 minutes, most were out of service. The October Revolution closed the range, and her guns were becoming increasingly accurate. Still, the Finns managed to get one of their 10-inch guns back in working order. And after a few near misses, the October Revolution turned and left. The next day, the Marat had her go, firing 133 rounds of high explosive shells, knocking down trees and destroying buildings and generally disrupting the firing of the Finnish guns. And she did have good accuracy overall. Again, the Finns nearly missed the battleship, causing the Soviets to disengage, with the Finns reporting a hit, but it doesn't seem to be so. Soon enough, the winter ice became too much, and the Soviet ships had to end operations for the winter. As I mentioned before, the Soviet ships, and notably the battleships, were based at Tallinn at the start of the Second World War, where the two battleships plus two Leningrad-class destroyer leaders and 20 destroyers were to operate behind the mine barrier. The Soviets were setting up at the entrance to the mouth of the Gulf of Finland, while two Kirov-class cruisers and two flotillas of destroyers would defend Riga. On June 20th, 1941, Marat returned to Kronstadt, but the October Revolution was still at Tallinn. To take from Stalin's ocean-going fleet, Jorgen Raw writes, "For the Soviet Navy, the situation was very difficult. The operation planning for a big ocean-going fleet was out of date because there were almost no ships for this program ready for operations. But the small war at sea concept could not be put to work either, because after a short time, the deep German thrust had endangered naval bases in the Baltic. Lea and Riga were lost on June 28th and July 1st. The Finnish declaration of war on June 26th threatened the new base at Hango at the entrance to the Finnish Gulf, and the German thrust into the direction of Leningrad endangered the Estonian base Tallinn in the Black Sea. The German-Romanian attack across the Dnieper threatened the important harbor of Odessa with encirclement in the north. The German attack in the direction of Murman was stopped at Leda, and the Fisherman's Peninsula was held with the support of the Northern Fleet, thus covering the entrance to the Kola Gulf. Within weeks of the German declaration of war and their subsequent advance, the mine barrier and defenses to the mouth of the Gulf of Finland were seemingly irrelevant as the Germans took Riga and soon Tallinn. With the German advance threatening Tallinn, the October Revolution was withdrawn to Kronstadt, and plans were made to evacuate troops from Tallinn and Hango, which was under heavy attack from the Finns. Tallinn was evacuated in late August. Hango held out until November. Losses during these evacuations were heavy in terms of ships and men. Still, the operations were carried out with determination, and 35,000 soldiers reached Leningrad, which was an important contribution to the defense of the city, of which the two Soviet battleships were effectively immobilized in the city due to enemy minefields. In the first 6 months of the war, 21,000 mines were laid in the Baltic, particularly in the Gulf of Finland, with some historians describing the sea as being polluted with mines. Operations in Leningrad were further hampered by a lack of fuel. Nevertheless, the battleships played a very important role in the defense of the city from the restricted waters between Kronstadt and the city. October Revolution shelled German positions near Crown Soilo and Petergof on the 8th of September. while Marat the next day opened fire with her 12-inch guns on the 18th German Army. For the remainder of the siege, which lasted until 1944, the battleships provided excellent gunfire support for the defenders. Before we continue, I should mention the battleships received refits and upgrades during the war, as noted by these particulars from warships of the Soviet fleet. However, the cost of war was high for the Soviet battleships, especially in the Baltic, where to take from the Clawflin. Both battleships suffered hits from German artillery and aircraft bombs in the first days of the siege, but none of these hits caused serious damage. That changed on September 23rd. 1941, when Morro was attacked by successive waves of dive bombers and hit by two 1,000-kilogram bombs, 2,225-pound bombs almost simultaneously. Both bombs struck in the vicinity of the forward superstructure. There immediately followed a detonation of the forward magazines. The turret was heaved up. The superstructure, including the conning tower and forward funnel, was blown to starboard. 326 men were killed, including the captain and executive officer. In the forward part of the hull, from frames 20 to 57, was demolished. The after part of the ship was still afloat. However, progressive flooding eventually caused the ship to settle in 11 meters, 36 feet of water. The ship was raised and returned to service as a floating battery. Initially, her undamaged third and fourth turrets were used in this role, and by the autumn of 1942, the second turret was in working condition. The ship was struck by enemy shells on further occasions, but wasn't damaged further. In May 1943, she returned to her original name of Petropavlovsk and continued to operate as the floating battery Petropavlov. By the end of the siege, she had fired 1,971 305mm shells. There were plans for her to be reconstructed in the future, something we've covered in another video. Link in the description. October Revolution was badly damaged as well in September 1941, when 3 bombs hit between frames 20 and 30, putting 2 main battery turrets out of action. She was taken to the Baltic yard for repairs on the 23rd of October. While she was there, she was damaged by German aircraft on the 4th of April 1942, being hit by 1 heavy and 3 medium bombs, and was again hit by 3 bombs on the 24th of April. He was finally repaired and ready for action in November 1942. She supported the Soviet breakout from Leningrad in January 1944. And on June 9, 1944, she became the last Soviet battleship to fire shots in anger. On July 22, 1944, she was awarded the Red Banner for her service in the siege of Leningrad. Like the Paris Commune, the October Revolution survived the war intact. Unlike the Jean Palmer, and the October Revolution was scrapped in the mid-1950s. As for the Paris Commune, the war in the Black Sea revolved around surviving air attacks and bombarding Axis soldiers attacking Soviet cities, as well as transporting troops around the Black Sea. She was based out of Sevastopol when the Germans invaded, and at the end of October, the Germans approached the Crimea. She was ordered to withdraw to save her ports on the Caucasian coast. The Paris Commune's first combat mission came on the 26th of December, 1941, where she opened fire on German and Romanian positions south of Sevastopol. A month passed before she sorted again, and on the 29th of December, she steamed into Sevastopol's harbor's South Bay and took the advancing Germans under fire, shooting 179 12-in and 265 120mm shells, then taking over 1,000 wounded on board. She left Sevastopol on the 31st. Most fire support missions were carried out over the coming months, and by the end of March, her 305mm guns had been worn out, and they were realigned at Poti. But she wouldn't fire her guns in anger again during the war. In 1942, the Black Sea Fleet suffered extremely heavy losses in destroyers, mostly due to air attacks. So the Naval Command made the decision to not make the ships of the fleet take such risks, and therefore weren't exposed to combat missions anymore. Paris Commune was given her old name of Sevastopol in 1943, as she remained in Poti until 1944, eventually returning to her namesake city in November 1944. I should mention some of her 120mm guns were taken off in 1943 for use as coastal artillery in the Novaris area. But the ship survived the war and was broken up in the late 1950s. The Soviet battleships didn't do anything that flashy as compared to their Western counterparts in terms of battle and the open sea, but still made reliable artillery platforms playing useful roles during their service in the Second World War. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.